I'm Mort from Mort's Garage. I'm from California. I got sick being here on the East Coast. Thank you so much for that. But I'm here with my family, and so my daughter's got a cold, and that means that Dad's gonna get a cold too. It's just how it is. Glad you're here because I want to get into a lot of things that are sort of channel specific. The Finish the Hunt stuff that I'm doing on my channel right now is about getting into the sort of mindset, the psychology of why do we do this? Why do we have entire wings of our homes dedicated to thousands of video games and collectibles, not unlike that image there, which is, of course, the garage. And just sort of wanting to be, the phrase that I love with all of this is curiosity, not condemnation, because I think when you just go straight to condemnation and judgment, we don't change or explore. We defend and we kind of protect ourselves. But if you get curious, I think there's a lot that can come from it. I also want to just give a really big disclaimer, which is, though I am, in my profession, I'm a therapist, this is not like therapeutic advice. So this is just my observations from my kind of going through all of this. I hope that it means something to you. It's a little less than the kind of weird, goofy panels that Josh and I do, but it's meant to just be a good conversation with hopefully some insight. And my goal is that at the end of this, you might have one or two personal thoughts that help you to enjoy what I think are the real benefits of collecting. There's a lot of really fun stuff about this, namely that you're getting to see the greatest panel in the history of panels right now because you're here. So let me get into that. But first, I want to show you an image. This, my friends, is a Funkoland price sheet from 1998 that I secured from Reddit, so it's entirely accurate. If you look real closely, which you probably can't see too well, I want to read you the prices of a few games from 1998 and what their prices are. And some of you already know this. I see you shaking your heads. Little Samson went for a cool $7. Hagane. Anyone raise their hand and guess how much Hagane went for?
13. 5.
A little higher?
7.
7 is correct. Okay, but what about one of the classics of Grail Super Nintendo games, Aero Fighters? Give me a guess. $10. $5. So for a cool $20, you could have purchased 3 games that today cost a mere $4,710. Oh, actually, there's a bit of a flaw in the data. Inflation. Hang on. So $20.98. Carry the 1, 3, 4, $40. So it's a little off still. But $40 to $4,700, humongous jump. And yet a lot of us, myself included, are looking at this stuff kind of going, I feel like I have to have this. This is something that I need in my life. And that to me is just an incredibly fascinating thing to think about. Do I need this? Why do I want this? So prices are getting insane, and it became all too real for me specifically when I started looking at completing the N64 set with every game, every box, every manual, except for the one, which at retail value is, depending on condition, can be around $4,000 for like 8 sheets of paper. And so I kind of felt like the whole collecting world is going insane. And then I feel like I'm going a little insane trying to keep up with it. Thankfully, I collected a lot of my stuff back in the 90s and, kind of the early 2010s. But still, when I walk on the convention floor here at Retro World Expo or any other convention, buy-sell trade event, browsing on eBay, I'm regularly gobsmacked at just how opportunistic and crazy these prices get. And yet at the same time, there's a giant community of wonderful geeks like myself. You may or may not identify as geek. I do. We're all up for it. We're all here for it. I can think of many conventions where people would come by and go, oh man, I found this like amazing game for $1,500. And it's normally $2,000. And I'm like, but it's still $1,500. Like that's a lot of money. So how do we get there? And there's like kind of multiple things. So it's all resellers' fault. Let's go. We're done. No, I'm kidding. It's a lot more to that. But that's collecting games in 2024. So I'm not an expert in economics. And those would be more sort of equipped to describe market changes and how markets work, supply and demand, excuse me, et cetera. But but I am someone who's affected by it, and I look around it. I look around all of this with fascination and frankly some excitement. Like many of you, when I was young, I played Nintendo. How many of you prior to NES was your first time really actively playing games? By show of hands. Okay, how many of you got into playing games in the NES era? Yeah, so that's childhood for all of us. Like many of you, now that I'm older, I still enjoy playing Goonies 2, Contra, Capcom games on the NES. I still love all of this stuff. And I like it so much today that I not only play it, but I collect it. And I collect other systems too, as I know many of you do. So for years, I'd spent valuable resources like time and money and time and then more time looking for this stuff, finding it, thinking about it. And I got to that point of 296 individual copies of Nintendo 64 games, compiling and kind of going into my home and into a storage shed and getting this stuff and going with it and finally getting one manual away from having everything. And I'm kind of thinking, okay, I'm going to be okay with not getting that manual. Prices had climbed so much, especially post-COVID, that it was like, it's going to be okay. Excuse me, pardon my throat. If anyone has hot water? I know that those supposedly do, but it did not work. So, yeah. I have throat coat in here. Any singers like Russ in here? Throat coat's supposed to help your throat not sound like you smoked 10 packs of cigarettes, but here we are. So one manual away from everything, but the prices had continued to climb so much that gaming markets had made it all but impossible to consider as a responsible husband and father buying this stuff. But I'm a responsible husband and father, and I'm buying this stuff. So what does that say about me and denial and justification? Quite a bit. So I reasoned to myself that it's fine. I don't need the extra manual. I'll live without it. But something started to happen. While I was fine with being without the manual, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to document not just the financial, flipping your way to something, but the emotional. Like a lot of channels get into, oh my gosh, I found this thing, and then they flip their way and they get it, and it's great, and that's super fun. That's what I'm doing. But emotionally, like we're flipping a little bit as well, I think, and we're going along with it. And I was like, so what is that? So here we are. I imagine that many of you are here because either you can relate with this subject, or you just have incredible taste in YouTube channels. But perhaps you're curious and have observed similar things in yourself. So hopefully there'll be some good questions. Number one, let's talk about meaning. And I'm convinced that meaning in behavior is driven by conscious and unconscious, methods of deriving meaning from things. Some of those are healthy, some of those are not so healthy. So one of the main reasons we do anything at all is because of the meaning it provides to us. A sense of purpose, however big or small. And the question of purpose is at the central core of religious faiths, of philosophical inquiries like existentialism. It's a key part of what makes us human, is finding meaning in the things that we do. And yet at the same time, some of us, we don't realize the meaning that we're ascribing to the things that we're doing. So I'll give you an example. For some of us, we go to our job to pay our bills, but for some of us, our purpose is in our job. Or maybe the meaning of video games is obvious to us. It's fun, it reminds us of a time in our past, or happy moments. But for some of us, we may have motivations and compulsions we aren't aware of. And these motivations, I think, for me anyways, are sometimes masking something a little bit deeper. And that's what I want to get into. So let me give you a couple of fun examples of how this might play out. How many of you, and if you raise your hand, you might be calling yourself out here. How many of you are chronically late? Yeah, okay, a couple of us. How many of you are late often, but maybe not chronically? Okay. Why do you think you're late? Someone tell me. Procrastination. And why do you think you procrastinate?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Could it be an incentive thing, like you have no reason to be early?
You have no reason to be early is a great answer.
Or there's no social pressure exerting upon you to say, I better be there at a certain time.
Okay, good.
I can show up whenever, it doesn't matter.
I could show up whenever, it doesn't matter. I'm just gonna, whatever. Yeah, good.
I'm going to judge you for it.
Yeah, there's no like, if I'm late, I don't lose my pay or something, right? Yeah, okay. How about you just don't want to be there? Sometimes I'm late to things because I'm like, yeah, I don't really care. But I wouldn't say that out loud, but I'm living, and the fruit of the way that I'm living is an unconscious motivator of, yeah, but I don't want to be there. What about, this is like a cliche, this was a joke on Modern Family, but why do you think people yell?
Because they want to be heard. They want people to pay attention to them. They want, the forcefulness of their voice implies they want to be taken seriously.
That's right. So if you raise your voice, it's because you want to be heard. You want to be taken seriously. Think of arguments you've been in, the last 5 or so arguments you've been in. There may be an argument that you've been in where you had to repeat yourself. And at each repetition, you went a little louder and a little louder. It's like, is that an impulse thing? Is that, no, I don't feel like you hear me. Let me get a little louder just to make it clear. Like, oh, okay, we're listening. I'm paying attention. So as I observe my own habits, collecting 2,500 physical copies of video games, not counting collectibles, magazines, and the occasional figure or two, I just think, 2,500 video games is a little extreme. And yet at the same time, I bought like 10 video games yesterday. The question has lingered, if I just want to play these games, I can do that. I can emulate them. I can play them on the Switch's online shop. I can download them. I can, why collect physical copies of things that are already largely preserved? I know there's exceptions. Not everything is preserved. But, these things can be read. I can read the Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut manual anytime I want. And yet still, I'm doing it. So why do we do this? So I think here's a few reasons why. Broadly speaking, I think there's healthy and unhealthy. How do you define healthy, though? Like, have you heard this? Like, it's just not healthy for me. Like, what are we basing that on? Usually we have an operational definition for words like healthy and unhealthy. And so, one of the things that I heard a peer of mine, a colleague, say was, I think that healthy, 2 of the biggest features of being a healthy person are being emotionally secure and being flexible. So think of this. When we watched the Olympics, how long do you think people stretched for before they got out and competed?
Depends on how much time they have before their event.
But it was an important part, right? So your body has to be flexible physically to adapt to what's going on in the tasks that are at hand. You get the best performance when you're flexible. I think emotionally, having some degree of flexibility is a really healthy thing to go towards. The other thing with health is being emotionally secure. I think of this like, think of a tree and a tornado goes through. It might blow all of the leaves off, but the tree is still pretty firm in the ground, depending on the amount of chaos that's there. So in other words, we're affected by what happens. We're not stoic, but at the same time, our core beliefs, we can question them, we can bring them into inquiry, but we're not necessarily at all times trying to, just do what everyone else is doing. There's a sense of self that's in all of that. I think those are some terms that I think those are healthy. Even personality disorders, like when you get into things like borderline personality disorder, for example, narcissistic personality disorder, there's a sense of rigidity in those personality disorders that makes them what they are. And so I think when we're healthy, we kind of get those things. And there's fruits of that as well. So I'll get to that in a minute. So when I think of what evidence is a healthy life, I think like the things that I see that are healthy are like people who have boundaries. Like, hey, you know what? I got to say no. Too much time, too much money, etc. I think of things like pursuing meaningful relationships. Anyone familiar with the Harvard study about men's happiness?
When was that conducted?
Over 75 years.
Is it still applied today?
They just wrapped it up. There's a TED Talk on it. It's fascinating. The reason it's the men's study is because when they started the test, I don't think women were attending Harvard yet. And so that's why it's the men's study. They found there's a number one contributor to what makes men live the longest with the least amount of health problems and the happiest. Can you guess what that one thing is?
Money?
No.
Meaning?
Meaning? No.
Relationships?
Well, did someone say tacos? Because that's a really good answer. Give me one in the back. I heard someone over here.
Family?
Family, you're very close.
A healthy body to put your brain into. Like,
Children? Community?
Friendship?
Yeah, you guys are kind of saying the same thing, but differently. Meaningful relationships. People who had meaningful relationships, and I might be screwing up the data. I apologize to anyone who I'm messing this up for. If you had high cholesterol, but had meaningful relationships, you would still live longer than someone who was lonely. And their kind of conclusion was basically loneliness kills. So I think of anything that brings people together, and collecting, we're together right now. There's a lot of you that I know because of this. There's vendors on the show floor that I see that I'm like, I feel joy when I see The Cultured Gamer or some of these other people, or I sing, Video Game Votary in French, and so many people who are here who are hanging out. And there's something about that brings meaning and joy and all of that. So I wouldn't want it to be said that every one of us who collects has serious psychological problems. But some of us do. So, but that's okay. We all have our things. So if collecting is somehow taking away from any of that, that's when I get really curious. But curious, not necessarily condemning. So here's reasons why I think people collect. Let me kind of jump right into this. Number one, collecting's been around for centuries. You dig up like old ancient civilizations and cultures, there's lots of little like trinkets and things in like certain homes. I don't know if you remember this from your history books from when you were in school, but collecting is nothing new. And in fact, I think it's really interesting because it expresses things in the culture. For example, when you think of preservation, when you observe a preservation of video games from the 90s, what do you think it's going to say about the culture? Someone give me an answer. What? It was great. It was the best of days. Well, in the 70s and 80s, we had all this crazy sci-fi stuff on the boxes, almost like an imagination about the world to come and the future. In the 90s, it was about mascots with attitude. Like, what did that say about the culture? And in the 2000s and 2010s, we get really dark and gritty and serious, almost as a reaction to all of that. The video games stuff, I think, do express something about the culture. When we collect it, we're collecting eras of things that express something meaningful in the culture. I'll never forget seeing the movie Rocky for the first time. Anyone seen Rocky? Yeah. I mean, come on, classic. I'm 44. I used to work at a university, and one of the film professors there and I were talking, and I was like, I just watched Rocky for the first time in, I don't know, years maybe. I was in my early 20s. And he immediately goes, you can't appreciate it. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he goes, the whole nation, when Rocky came out, felt like it was being beat down left and right. When that movie came out, Rocky represented the American underdog. And in a way, watching him succeed felt like we can do this. And he's like, when you take that context out of it, the art is different. And I think in some ways, like understanding and appreciating, when we preserve things, we see what it reflects and expresses in the culture at large. So, might we say something similar about how games make us feel today? I think so. Collecting can also have a lot of upsides. I think it can be stress relieving, fun. For me, it's one of the best ways to go out and get a nice long walk in. When we go to the swap meets in the videos, we'll walk for a few miles easy every time. I'm with my friends. There's worse ways to spend your time than hanging out, cracking jokes, going for a long walk. It almost sounds romantic. It's not, but So I think there's a lot of really good upsides. It can be very stress relieving. It can also be very stress inducing as well. It can also remind you of times that surround what you find. For personally, not culturally, but personally, when you grab, when you see that Blockbuster video sign, what happens in your nervous system? When you see an NES box sitting out somewhere at the show floor, do you immediately get transported back to a sleepover? And you get that feeling that comes with it. That can be fun to reminisce on those things. But it can also get a little out of control. And this is the thing that I go, oh, interesting. What is the out of control part? So I've seen some collectors appear to be controlled by their collections and their collecting habits in a way that doesn't add to their life, but it looks like it's taking away from it. And so examples could be you're overspending, maybe a poor use of your time. Even when you're not collecting, you're constantly thinking about collecting. It's like the only thing on your mind. And there's an inability to self-regulate. Family or friends are going like, hey, I think you're a little too into this. Sometimes they may just not get it, but sometimes they may have a point. And I think sometimes if we're offended in our reactions, it's because it's touching on something that might be kind of real and is worth looking at. This is not a fun one. That's why I put the asterisk next to it. But collecting can be profitable, which seems to be new with video games over the last 5-10 years. In the past, if you collected video games, it was like, why are you hoarding plastic junk? And now it's like, you see some of those graded games out there on the show floor and you're like, dear God. So the other reason some collectors collect is an investment. And whether that's video games or otherwise. Love it or hate it, the fact that games have monetary value seems to contribute to their cultural significance because we spend money on what we value. If it didn't mean something to us, we wouldn't spend the money on it. I don't think it's ultimately the resellers, I think it's us. Like we set the market price because we pay the prices that other people set. If we don't, the prices have to come down. But we value it. So it's a big point of contention. One study suggests that 83% of collectors anticipate their collections growing in value, but less than half the sample stated collecting was a good investment, which is weird. If you believe that you're going to gain value, why wouldn't you invest more? Anyway. And this, of course, has drawn rage. YouTube channels are dedicated to hating on this subject and everything. And I think there's some good critiques that come in through all of that as well. Let me look really briefly at this one, maybe the first question that I get when people ask, so you have how many video games? Do you have an addiction? How many of you have been asked if you think you have an addiction? How many of you think you might have an addiction? All right, that's a fair question, right? It's not, many of us can get addicted to some things. I think collecting can be addicting, but it is not inherently an addiction. I think part of it is maybe just the subject of what we're collecting makes it kind of an easy target. People collect rocks when they go to the beach. They collect cars. People collect all kinds of things. But when someone has 2,500 copies or 1,000 copies or 100 copies of anything, that isn't part of an inventory to sell, it's worth asking this question, do I have an addiction? And so it can be addicting. And I think one of the things that can sort of give us a tell about, how many of you saw the video I did with Raymond Ivy about addiction? So on my channel, I had a therapist who specializes in addiction. We really dive into this, and he gives his perspective. At the end of the video, he diagnosed me with something. He diagnosed me as being a nerd, and so I thought that was a pretty accurate. But addiction is any inability to stop using a substance or engaging in a behavior, even though it may cause physical or psychological harm, by its definition. So many people enjoy having a cocktail, but some people can't stop at one. It gets out of control. Many people love to go to the gym, but some people over-exercise because they're addicted to sculpting their body in a way that does more damage to it than good. And so when I look around my garage and the 2,500 games that fill it, I wonder to myself, what am I doing? Could I stop? And if I were to quit for 6 months, if I were to just have a sabbatical for a few months, could I? And I think obviously the best place to explore these questions are with a trained professional like a therapist. But here's a couple of questions that I just want to share with you that I use from a point of just the font got screwed up. But these are questions that I think have been helpful for me in self-regulating, and they may be helpful for you too. Number one, am I going past my budget? That's a pretty obvious one. If I'm going into debt to collect video games, that's a problem for me. Am I thinking about collecting all the time, even when I'm not collecting? It's a fair question. If I needed to for any reason, could I sell my entire collection? How many of you had to sell your collections before? Or sell collections of anything? Okay, a couple of us. Also, Tyler from My Retro Life, he went into a couple of videos about when he sold all of his old games that he collected with his dad. Did you guys see those episodes? It was pretty powerful because he kind of got to a point where he's like, I need to let these things live in my heart and not physically in my hands, and it was his prompting. So everyone will answer this question differently, and I wouldn't judge either way with which you do it, but for me, this is a self-regulating question. This is my favorite question about substances, about process addictions, which are behavior addictions, and this. If right now I don't have an addiction, I don't, how would I know when I did? What would have to be happening where I would look at to myself internally and go, you know what? I think because I'm doing this, this, and this, that's when I think it's an addiction, place to be at. What would have to be happening? That's some of my favorite questions to sort of personally ask about what's happening. So when we're addicted to something, the inner motivation and drive go from being pushing us, from this addiction that's pushing us into compulsive behavior, and we sort of feel like it's controlling us more than we're controlling it. And that's a good place to stop and go, I may need to kind of ask myself some questions. Let's talk about my favorite thing, anxiety. Any other people deal with anxiety in this room? Yeah, like all of us. So that's good. You're not alone, even though we feel like we are. But I want to focus on something I think can be a bit of a hidden area when it comes to collecting, which is anxiety and grief. You did not come to a collecting convention to talk about grief and anxiety, but I've sucker punched you all into being here for it. So here we go. According to NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, 21% of US adults experienced mental illness in 2020. That's 1 in 5, roughly. That's a lot. And it's up from 19%. And since 2020, I heard there was like a global pandemic or something that might have exacerbated some of these stats a little since then as well. But the largest expression of mental illness on record is anxiety. 19% of US adults suffer from an anxiety disorder. And anxiety in general, it's a state of feeling unsafe. It can be a chronic thing, or it can be related to something specific, like a phobia or something like that. But the sort of anxious inner monologue goes something like this. Something bad is going to happen. Even if I can't see it, I just feel it. Something bad is going to happen. Worse, I'm powerless to protect myself against it. Someone's going to accuse me of something, and I'm going to be ruined. That's the end of my life. That's it. For myself, I was not the most well-liked elementary schooler, and I had the sense that people were kind of not, when you're bullied, you kind of might unconsciously bring that into your adult relationships. Like other people have it out for you because you know what it's like to have people have it out for you at certain points of your life. And so whether you realize it or not, you're kind of carrying that around. And so when you feel that anxiety, games can be incredibly soothing and satisfying and distracting. Maybe it's even just social things. We don't pick up on social cues quite the same as other people do. And so, when we play games, we understand the game's world and its rules when we struggle to understand the other world's rules and what's going on. It can be a way to distract. I'm sick of feeling all this. I need to distract myself with something else. And as we collect more and more, we have to constantly find new things to collect because it's almost like we're running away from something emotionally rather than dealing with it and going through it. As I've aged more, I've noticed myself struggling with anxiety in ways that I didn't expect. I had a boss at my old job. He sent me a text message and he said, "Hey, can I talk to you tomorrow morning?" He's a former police captain, and he's my boss. That's all you need. And so I'm like, "Yeah, what's this regarding?" He's like, "Oh, we'll talk about it tomorrow." So I didn't sleep very good, but I interpreted immediately from that text message, danger. But did I have any evidence for danger? My boss was really happy with my work. They were happy with what I was doing. I had no sort of warnings, no write-ups, no nothing, but I assumed danger immediately because I'm wired pretty anxiously. And then we get in the next morning and he's like, "Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about this project we're working on. I'm really excited about it and love the work that you're doing." I'm like, "Well, don't make it sound so scary, man." And then he's like, "Well, you made it sound scary, not me. I didn't say anything that was scary. I just wanted to talk to you. I thought talking to me was a good thing, not a bad thing. Why do you think it's a bad thing to talk to me? Because you're my boss and you're a cop." So anyway, but that's how my interpretation worked, right? And so, it's easy to soothe yourself in a game world, distract yourself, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of people use things to distract themselves to deal with what's going on in life. And there's only so much you could do before it's like, I kind of need some time to be distracted. It's when it becomes the only thing that I think, oh, that's a point of being curious. What is it about this thing that feels overwhelming that I can't go through it? When I think of my favorite games, my favorite gaming memories, I get brought back to a time and a place that isn't now. And usually the memories that I'm associating with then are joyful ones. They're happy ones. I'm thinking of my friends and I beating Contra without having to use the Contra code, or going to Blockbuster and how come the Nintendo 64 doesn't have any new games, but the PS1 has 17 new ones this week? This is not fair. I cannot rent F-Zero X again. I need a new game. But at the same time, those are fun memories. Or I think of those things, but I also think of the bands that I used to go see, how my family was, where we lived, all of that stuff. And I want to kind of mentally feel that a little more than I want to feel now. And that can be kind of profound and powerful. So at middle age, it's interesting. I find myself at this stage of my life, when we're younger, we're looking forward. The older we get, the more we look behind. We think of like legacy and what did I do with my life? In the middle, we can look both directions a little differently. And that to me is like a really kind of interesting thing, because I think one of the things that can kind of break me up is how much time I spend looking behind and forgetting to look forward or just be in what's happening right now. So, and I think part of that is when we look behind, whether we realize it or not, we feel this feeling of grief. You think of like the definition of nostalgia, a sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. When we remember the past, we're grieving it a little bit, like we're missing it. And sometimes I think we don't realize that in collecting or playing old video games, old movies, old music, we are sort of dealing with some kind of a loss of when we felt like, man, I was well loved in high school, and then I went to college and felt like I was nobody and no one knew who I was anymore. So I love all of that time. It was the best time, rather than making the most out of the time now. So I think like grieving really comes up when it comes to some of this stuff, when we sort of put our thoughts to it. So I can't go back to my favorite decade, the 80s or the 90s, but I'm here now. And when I find myself realizing is I miss those times. Going into a Blockbuster without hardly a care in the world, playing a single game for hours on end, while someone else worries about the mortgage, health insurance, or other people aging around me, like my children. So we create these paired associations, and they do something to us. I think we're buying feelings a lot of times, not games. And that's the part of it that to me kind of made me go, oh, I wonder if that's like a good thing to process through of what feelings I need to work through. Because I think grief, anxiety, all of this stuff, there's kind of like, we can think that we're going around it by distracting ourselves. But when we're done distracting ourselves, we're still right at the beginning of the processing. When you go through it, and you go through the feelings of it, and you deal with it, that's when we heal and we grow. But if we're constantly distracting ourselves and numbing ourselves, it just comes back as strong as it ever was. And we have to go back to those other methods, and it's ultimately not very satisfying. Grief is about death, but it's not about just the death of a person or a loved one, like an animal or something like that. Death is also about seasons. I miss times, that have passed for me. I'm grieving a certain stage of life, or when things felt new, or whatever it is. And it's important to sit in those things. And the way that we heal, I think, as we talk about it, we share these stories. It's so cool. I was just in here for the Atari one a minute ago, and hearing him talk about the industry of the past, and talking about what he was experiencing and what people had to deal with. And it's like, that's a time that once existed that no longer does. It's just interesting to sit with it and to feel it and to think it through. So I want to make it clear again, just because there's these other things that come along with this, I don't think that everything is pathology. I don't think all of us are grieving and anxious and depressed and dealing with all this stuff. Certainly not. But I do think there's places for introspection that can make our lives more enriched. And I would encourage all of us to do that. But let me just kind of share a couple of things that I think can be the benefits of collecting. In my collecting experience, I've become convinced that collecting can be a very fun, enjoyable part of it. How many of you are having fun just being here? Yeah. Okay, everyone raise your hand. That was like that was the easy answer one. How many of you like cake? Well, I guess I like cake. Yeah, it's awesome. But the chief of that is, I think it's the games, but it's the relational part, the community, meeting people who are like-minded, who have similar experience that we can relate to. We feel like we're kind of part of something bigger than just ourselves. And collecting, I think, does that. It is so hard. The older we get, my friend, as you get older, it is so hard to find relationships and good relationships as you keep going on. And so the older we get, the more isolated we get because life demands it. When you have to work as much as you do, you have family responsibilities. So having something that creates new friends is a beautiful thing. And I think collecting and having a hobby does that. It's a really good thing. I also think that having a shared interest that draws everyone together, it's fun hearing, I've enjoyed just hearing the history and the stories behind different games, not just what they mean to you personally, but the craft of them and how they were developed and under which circumstances, or how Nintendo absolutely stole from a jazz musician for the theme for Super Mario Brothers. I think that stuff is just absolutely fascinating to listen to and to think about. And you know, it's as I think about like the thing that makes us live longer and be happiest is relationships. I think collecting can be a really great way of facilitating some of those relationships. And so to that end, wherever you may be at, you know, people use book clubs, they use fantasy sports leagues, which by the way, can we just admit, fantasy sports is JRPGs for jocks. Okay, you're reading stats, you're having your teams battle one another, and then at the end, like you compile it all back together. It's the same thing. So everyone loves JRPGs, whether you want to admit it or not. But the point of it is that I think there's something really special about this, and special about this moment, and being here together, and being with everyone. And for that reason, I say, whatever you're at, whatever you're doing with collecting, may you be blessed, happy, healthy, and doing well. Thanks very much. So in my therapy work, am I direct with patients about video games? I'm not, because the therapeutic relationship is the driver of change. And so if I do anything to make it about my experiences in a way that gets out in front of the other person, that can take away from that. And so if the other person talks about it, I might go with them on the conversation, but as a therapist, you're constantly thinking, what's the therapeutic goal? What's the diagnosis? What's the treatment plan? And then what benefits the client the most? So as an authentic person, sometimes it might naturally insert it into the conversation, but I don't share with my clients that I have a YouTube channel or that I collect or any of that kind of stuff. Oh, FOMO kind of a thing?
Then they jack up the prices as they see the demand goes higher, and it sort of feeds into the cycle, which I think makes these behaviors worse.
Yeah, but I don't think that's exclusive to video games. I think that's exclusive to personality types. So I think people who want to get profit have to find, someone said this to me about marketing. All of us want to buy, but none of us wants to be sold to. And I think like at some point, there's something genuine about video games, because I think there is all this emotional stuff with it in ways that other mediums may or may not share. And I think that people can exploit that, but I think any marketer is looking for ways to just drive profits in general. So I don't necessarily think that's exclusive to collecting, but at the same time, I think you can sense when someone is saying something just to get you to buy versus saying something because that's just authentically how they feel. So
ideally, you create a connection with your customer.
Yeah.
Kind of motivate the purchasing decision.
Yeah, if the market price is this, hopefully you have a good experience with me. Like I do this at my buy-sell trade events. I see a lot of the same people, and I'll regularly give discounts, but it's not because I'm like a drug dealer that's like, all right, I got you on the hook. This week it's this much, but next week it's going to be double if you don't buy it from me. I don't do that kind of stuff anymore. Anyway, so yeah. If you liked this talk, it's MORT'S Garage. If you didn't like it, it's Pixel Game Squad. So there you go. I thought of going for like a Dreamcast set, but then I just really quickly realized how much I don't want another full set of anything. And so I actually sold off a bunch of my Dreamcast set just to the essentials. I'm now going through PS2 and selling off a bunch of that. I sold off more than half of my GameCube stuff. Excuse me. And so a lot of the N64, I genuinely love to go in my game room and pull out a random box and just read the back. And then, because it's legal because I have all the cartridges, pop in the emulation one that has everything in it and just go, I haven't played this one in a while, let me play it. And then just like try something new. So yeah, so I think there's a lot to play right now. And so some of the video content I have planned, there'll always be game hunting stuff, but I'm going to see if people are interested in like top 5 lists and stuff like that, and if that has any traction. Yeah, I think that can be the downside of it. If it's not like regulated as something that adds to your life, like I wouldn't want my identity to be the guy who collects. I'd want my identity to be the guy who loves his wife and kids and makes cool art and also has too many video games in his garage. So I think like that's the sort of urgency behind all of this is just to say like, as we make the most of our lives and however you may do it, and also in sharing this is like, these are some of my personal reflections. I could be off on data for like the broad, application of it. But in general, I think that there's a lot of, like that question of identity is a big one. When someone says like, what are you? Your next response to that question, I think says a lot about how you see yourself and how others see yourself. And so, I think if someone says, who are you? I think the first things I would probably reference are my love of my family and my faith. I think one of the benefits of collecting and benefits of collecting a full set, even if I don't see myself playing one of the 7 versions of Madden on the N64, is I think having a goal for collecting actually is a pretty good thing, because what it does is it sort of protects you from just going crazy with everything. And so, like in that way, it's about the hunt much more for me than it is about anything else. And so having a goal to sort of put the hunt in a particular window is really good. And so I'll be the first to admit that like I'm probably not going to play through Hercules on the N64. I tried Batman Beyond for 5 minutes and that was all I needed. And so, you know, but at the same time, I constantly ask myself like, well, if I had to sell this, would I? And, you know, I feel like I could, but I guess the time would have to come to it to really prove that. So I guess in general, it's a great question, because it's really true. Like, you're not going to play all these things and yet you're collecting all of them. But I think having a goal towards anything, it can be satisfying in its own way too. Yeah, this is one of the things I love about therapy, is working this out relationally with someone and kind of processing what it would mean to sell it. What would it mean to collect it? What would it mean to keep it? You know, and getting answers to all of that stuff, I think would really give a good sort of, because I think everyone will have a different answer to that question. So it's a really good one. But I think like Tyler's a great example from my retro life, because he just got to a point where he's like, it's time. It's just time. I know it's time. And other people may not ever feel that way, and that's okay. But he did. And I think for you, for me, for all of us in the room, we all might kind of go, no, I'm good. I'm enjoying collecting. And other people might go, it's time. And that's good. So that's up to each individual person. So.